Welcome to the We Need Water podcast. My name is Michael Brandt, and I'm the Water Resources Manager for Cascade Water Alliance in King County, Washington. Cascade is a municipal water supplier providing drinking water to more than 380,000 residents. I'm glad you're here. I want you to truly care about water and make it your personal mission to become a steward of this incredible resource. Our topic today is how to create a resilient landscape, and our guest is Jessi Bloom. Jessi was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest and has a strong background in horticulture and the environmental sciences. In early 2000, she decided to start an ethical business in the green industry to fill a niche for organic and ecological landscaping. The Seattle Times named her a rock star in the ecological gardening movement. She led Northwest Bloom to numerous environmental awards, traveling nationwide as a speaker, and she's a best-selling author. Her books include Free-Range Chicken Gardens, Practical Permacultural Design, and Creating Sanctuary, Sacred Garden Spaces, Plant-Based Medicine and Daily Practices to Achieve Happiness and Well-Being. Jessi's work has been featured in many national and local media outlets, including the New York Times, Better Homes and Gardens, Sunset Magazine, Disney, Martha Stewart Living, Mother Earth News, The Utne Reader, Fine Gardening Magazine, and PBS's Growing a Greener World TV. Welcome, Jessi.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. It's such an honor.
Well, I'm glad you're here. Let's jump right into this. What is a resilient landscape? What does that mean exactly? What problems are we trying to solve?
Oh, there's a whole host of things going on outdoors, as anyone who's outdoors might be very, very aware of. The climate's changing. Our landscapes are changing as well as a result of that. And so resiliency, in my mind, can mean many things, but ultimately in the landscape context, is it going to survive? Is it going to thrive? And what does that look like? What needs to change? We're dealing with temperature fluctuations, pretty extreme in some cases. We're dealing with plants not being able to adapt to those changes very well. And as a result, we have a lot of stressed plants. We have plants that have pest problems or disease problems. We have more rain than we're used to at certain times of the year and not enough at others, which was always kind of an issue in the Pacific Northwest. But now that problem is even worse. And now we're dealing with wildfire, smoke. So there's all kinds of things happening. And a lot of our landscapes are not quick to adapt, especially if they're reliant on human input or resources like water that we have to manually deliver as a survival mechanism. And if the plants aren't thriving naturally, as these changes happen, they might start to decline. And we should be addressing this right now before it's too late, before we lose a lot of plants, before things change even more.
Some of the really hot summers we've had in recent years, I can really tell the toll in my neighborhood when I'm just up on the second floor. 2 summers ago, I remember that so much of the tops of the deciduous trees, they were just toasted. That's really what they looked like, absolutely toasted.
Yeah, they're not used to this heat, and neither are we. I mean, I've been here my whole life and have worked outdoors, and it's really been the past 3 to 5 years that things have shifted pretty drastically, and the plants are not able to go inside or go into air conditioning or deal with these temperature changes like we can. And so we're seeing a lot of stress in plants, especially older ones, a lot of broadleaf evergreens, conifers. They're having a harder time adapting. Luckily, the deciduous plants, when they drop their leaves, they'll regrow new ones, but it doesn't mean they're not having those same stress problems from the heat. But on top of that, we also have just erratic weather patterns. So last fall, we had almost no fall. We went from summer all the way through October, very smoky and hot. And then we went almost directly into winter with a cold snap. And so a lot of those plants didn't have time to adapt. And then on the flip side, we did that again this spring, where we had a really cold winter. It was actually fairly dry. And then we went into 80 and 90 degree temperatures way earlier than we normally would have. So fingers crossed that we don't continue on this trend and it gets worse and worse and worse every year. But that's unfortunately what a lot of the data trajectory looks like. So the question is, what do we do now? How do we adapt to this? How do we help our gardens adapt to it? And there's a lot of things that we can be doing, a lot of steps we can be taking now before we start to lose a lot more plants.
Mm-hmm. I've heard you talk a lot about the concept of permaculture. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so permaculture is a design toolkit. That's how I like to think of it. It's like a package of tools that we can put to use. The idea is that we're designing with ecological values, and it's based in rooted in ethics. So permaculture is rooted in taking care of the earth, taking care of people, and then giving back. But ultimately, it comes from and was originally, the ideas were brought over from indigenous land stewardship practices and kind of repackaged. So if you think about how indigenous cultures took care of land, that stewardship level, it wasn't buy and sell and degrade. It was let's nurture and take care of and utilize and have a relationship with the earth. And so permaculture is rooted in that. It's really about finding closed loop systems, not wasting resources, designing with survival in mind. In case of emergency, for example, do you have backups for your water supply? Do you have backups for your food supply? Those kinds of things. So it kind of gets into the prepper mindset a little bit, but it really is, how do we prepare to live without being reliant on all of these outside entities to take care of us? Whether it's the power company or water districts, grocery stores. In this area here, we have a number of natural disasters that could happen, but one of the big ones that we've all learned about was the earthquake that could happen at some point, right? And so if there was a big earthquake, what would we do individually and collectively in our communities? And so permaculture gets you thinking about those things. And it's not just at a garden level, it's also at an energy level, it's at a community financial level, it's at a social level. So it's a really great toolkit for designing systems and making decisions.
Permaculture is one of those ideas that sounds like something new, something that's just been invented, but it isn't, of course. It's a very old idea, how humans interacted with their landscapes for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got to get back to that.
Well, what are some of the trends you're seeing in landscape design and maintenance with the changing climate conditions?
Well, getting rid of all of the high resource elements. Lawn, some local jurisdictions in other parts of the country are giving rebates for people getting rid of their lawns. That's really great to hear and see. I think we're a ways away from that here in the Northwest. In the Northwest, we actually are getting rebates and seeing government support for stormwater management. So putting in rain gardens, doing more low impact design. So less and less impervious surface. So when we do have those major downpours and really wet periods, we're not creating problems downstream. Getting rid of lawns often means replacing them with sometimes low maintenance, like meadowscaping. Other times it might be food production. So at our company, we deal with a lot of different situations and scales of projects, and some are very food focused, some are very ecologically wildlife focused, or just low maintenance, wanting to recreate a forest sanctuary. So there's lots of possibilities, and the trends, I don't follow the landscape magazines or anything, kind of forge through in our own path of just being ecologically focused. But thankfully, that's starting to make some headways in, like, the Chelsea Garden Show had a lot of pollinator gardens and natural ecological systems in their show this year for, I think, the first time it was actually like really publicized in a big way. So we're seeing that become more prominent. And what that really means is to stop trying to control nature so much and let nature do its work. So there's a lot of ways that can be interpreted, but the more we try to manipulate the landscape, oftentimes the more damage we're doing. So I tend to be a little bit of an extremist, but I don't think of most weeds, the traditional weeds, I don't think of them as bad. I think of clover, for example, as a really beneficial plant. And most plants that we have been taught to dislike or not want in our gardens are actually doing a lot of ecological work, not just for the soil, but for pollinators or for the food chain. When people have insect problems, for example, I really try to break it down. Is it a problem or is it just part of the natural ecosystem, right? Are we feeding the birds, or is this something that you have to come all out with, all your pesticides, which I would never, ever advise anyone to do. But in the home garden, we have so many opportunities to create a sanctuary for all, for not just for ourselves, but for all the wildlife and the insects and the butterflies. So that is the trend that I like to see moving forward personally. But it really fits in with the model of resiliency, because if we try to control things, it's not always going to work out to our liking. How many times have you seen a hedge where someone's trying to grow the same thing in a row and then 2 or 3 die and there's a big giant hole? Nature would never create hedges like that, right? Nature, there's no such thing as a lawn. So lawns are a completely man-made human construct of an idea in our gardens that we have to work really hard to create, or to keep looking in a way that most people want them to look.
Those kinds of trends could not occur if customer attitudes weren't changing.
Yeah, a lot of it's education and mindset. Because of our company's values, I think we attract a lot of people who are already on board. But when I'm traveling and I'm teaching to a much broader audience, a lot of times I'm going back to that basic level of, okay, here's how an ecosystem functions. And here's why it's okay to have clover in your lawn, or it's okay that there's a dandelion in your bed. And it really takes a mind shift, because if someone's been brought up to believe that a plant is bad, then they have to be taught why that plant's not a bad thing, right? And that's not something that you see out and about every day, especially if you're shopping at a big box store or watching mainstream media where there's advertisements all the time that these things are worth, buying chemicals to treat. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely an education issue, but also I think it's also a generational thing. There's a period of time where that was really pushed, and then it's passed down, from father to son or mother to daughter, whatever. And we have to re-educate ourselves to go back to how we were originally meant to be in this environment with these plants.
I'm just kind of chuckling as you're talking, because I remember growing up and how I was taught what an appropriate landscape was supposed to look like. Very neat and tidy, lots of turf grass, cut very short, trimmed immaculately. Everything had to look just perfect. And, that's just how we thought back then. That's how it should be done. We didn't really question that.
I call that the military landscape. It's like crew cut, time is important. And nature's not allowed to do its thing at all, right? I grew up, so my childhood was, I had a forest in my backyard, and the lawn that we had, no one cared what grew in the lawn. In fact, daisies, which used to be in seed mixes pre-World War II, which you'll often see at state parks and other areas that have that natural original seed mix. But I used to make daisy chains, right? That was my childhood in a lawn. I was allowed to take a dandelion head and blow it and make wishes. Mm-hmm. So my association with those plants is very, very different. So yeah, how we grew up and our relationships with plants makes a very big difference in how we treat them later on in life, or how we assume the land should be treated later in life. And so if you were taught with that military landscape mindset, you might go your whole life thinking that was it. And someone who had a weed in their garden they were messy, right?
Right. That's
And I
true.
think,
You made value
yeah,
judgments about landscapes
yeah,
and the people who lived in those homes.
yeah. Someone who had I would call it the witchy garden, right? I heard another term for that called cottage core, where that might describe the aesthetics of what I do,
Hmm.
because I don't leave a bunch of bare ground in my designs. I want the landscape to be full and complete. Like if you were walking through a forest, there's not a lot of bare ground because plants are opportunistic and
Hmm.
they'll grow if their seeds can germinate. So we have to think about how the landscape would function naturally if we want our landscapes to be resilient. And a lot of that is modeling after nature, which is what permaculture does. But instead of always trying to fight with nature and make it conform to our ideals and our values, if we actually learned how to garden from nature's example,
Hmm.
there would be a lot less work, there'd be a lot less resources wasted. The aesthetics might be a little bit different, but there's always opportunities to add in little pops of color or beautiful texture, things that might be a little bit more ornamental. Um, we use native plants as a foundation in most of our design work, and we find that that helps really build the ecosystem early on, and then we can plug and play different ornamentals. But one of the factors right now with climate change and pollinators and just the plants struggling to adapt, I personally believe that going to those ornamentals for some of those ecological functions is fine. In fact, there's a lot of trees, shrubs, and perennials that are non-native that provide a lot of ecological functions in our gardens. So excluding them just for the sake of not having natives, I think is a mistake, especially if we're looking forward, because some of our native plants are not going to thrive
Hmm.
in the new heat and drought conditions. And so, as an arborist, a lot of times what I'm up against is looking at large conifers here in the Northwest and assessing if they're going to make it, or if we need to do any kind of mitigation or plan new species in their place. Um, we can plant the same species, but what we're finding and what is happening right now in the nursery industry and in our arboriculture is they're starting to look at the seeds genetically that are grown naturally at the furthest most southern point of where the natural range is. So in Doug fir, that might be 2,000 miles south from here, and in like central or southern Oregon, and propagating those plants that have much more heat tolerance than the ones that are from, say, British Columbia or somewhere here in Western Washington. So the genetics are going to be important, but then also looking at plants growing in those regions, and they may not be native to this bioregion, but they're native to the Pacific
Hmm.
Northwest in that southern point, and using those as replacements instead.
Okay. Well, let's get into where the rubber hits the road for a typical homeowner and talk about some specific actions that people can take to make their landscapes more resilient.
Well, the number one thing, the easiest thing I think people can do is mulch. It's going to protect soil. It's going to retain moisture in the summer months. It's going to feed soil if it's a good mulch. And then also protect the root zones in the winter from some of the temperature drops. So, as a rule of thumb, ecological garden would have most of the landscape covered, right? Like there wouldn't be big pockets of soil. But as it's getting established, there will be that extra space that you can mulch with a product. We will often use something called a dark bark, which is a composted wood material. And there's some mulches that aren't great. Rubber,
Mm.
obviously, some of the
Yeah.
synthetics I would never recommend. But mulching is a really great place to start. We can also get free wood chips from an organization called chipdrop.org, from local tree companies who are taking trees down and chipping them up. And they drop them off at folks' homes. And that can be used in a lot of situations where mulch, if it's not accessible, you can get it for free that way. There's other things that people can do outside of mulching. I'm usually doing a lot of editing right now in my consulting and design work. I call it editing because I'm going into gardens and listening to people where they're putting a lot of energy, whether it's water or time for plants that are struggling. And my philosophy is if a plant isn't going to thrive, I'm not going to nurture it along if it's not going to make it long term. And if it's a young plant, it is worth getting it to through that establishment period. But if it's an older plant, there's a big question of, is this worth trying to nurse along when it's really struggling or disease prone? And there's a lot of tree species right now that we're seeing without chemical treatment. It's really hard to control pests for. But so that editing will help simplify. And then replacing or planting with things that are very durable and resilient. And a lot of times in my mind, that means regenerative. So they'll grow quickly or have a lot of new growth over the course of a year. So if, like I mentioned, the deciduous trees, if they die back in fall and they lose all their leaves, they're regenerative and they grow new leaves next year. Evergreens have a little bit harder time because they're not as regenerative as deciduous. But there's a lot of plant scenarios where it depends on the very specific situation. And if we can start to think about, our plant selection as a long-term thing, do you really want to be growing plants that are reliant on water from you forever? And in my mind, the answer is no. So selecting drought-tolerant plants is critical. The other thing is to manage our water better. I deal with a lot of construction projects where the mindset is still to pipe the water and get it as far away from, the I think usable space as possible. But if we can create more rain gardens, or we can divert the water into ways to hydrate the garden instead of pipe it away, that's going to benefit us long term. It's also going to benefit our gardens. But we also need to select plants that are going to enjoy that water. So having those little bioretention cells or rain gardens or swales is a good way to get that water dispersed, but keep it on site. So luckily, the Rainwise project or program and other efforts here regionally are really strong. So there's a lot of resources available for folks to learn about that and potentially get rebate money from local jurisdictions or grant money. So that is a long-term, I think, water approach that involves a little bit more structural, infrastructure building. But a lot of what I see water wasted on is just poorly designed irrigation systems or poorly managed irrigation systems. And so that's another thing to change is, how do we put our irrigation systems together and then take care of them for the long term, and learn that it has to be changed based on the weather too. So a lot of tools there, not always the cheapest way to go about making big changes, but really for a resilient landscape, what if our water was turned off, right? And your plants were really reliant on that, what would happen to the garden? So I think the true test in a sustainable or resilient landscape is to have no input from humans. What would that look like? And what would happen to our landscapes? And nature would take over, right? Some plants wouldn't make it. Others might thrive. Other plants might volunteer naturally, move in.
I spend a lot of time in the mountains myself, and I often think about that when I'm out hiking, because you see such beautiful plants everywhere. And I think, well, nobody's out here maintaining this. It looks really great.
Yep. That's where my whole career started, growing up in the Northwest and out in the wilderness lands, and then going to school and realizing, like, why are we doing this much work when out in nature it happens effortlessly, and it's amazing and beautiful. But again, it goes back to those ideals and values of people in their gardening. And I think there's a way to have both. You can have that beautiful landscape that's native and then have pockets of ornamentals or edibles. It doesn't have to be one or the other. You can do both.
If someone was thinking about removing, say, a portion of their lawn, the turf grass, how would you recommend they start about that process? What should they think about in terms of replacement?
Plants that will fit the space. So if it's just a portion of the lawn, I'm assuming it's going to be the edge, which might mean small plants. It depends on how much of the lawn is being removed. Usually, it isn't until we remove the lawn entirely that our options open up quite a bit, and we have much more to play with in terms of ideas. But if you have a lawn and you're taking, say, 3 feet out, you need to fill that 3 feet in with something. And plants that are 3 feet wide may be limited, right? You might not have a lot. Or if you get anything bigger than that, it's going to shade the garden and create some more problems. Or hang over the lawn, and then you've got to, tame the plant that's out of control, even though it was put in the wrong space. That's a really common problem, is people just putting plants in space that there's not enough space for. But yeah, once the lawn's gone, then there's a great opportunity to put in meandering pathways or a forest. And as a designer, I have to think about all the constraints of the site, whether it's the size of the plant that can go in there or the height of the plant, because it might be close to the house or close to utilities or something like that. So there's a lot of pieces to put together to make the specific plant selection. But if we have a lot more room, then we have a lot more room to come up with ideas to play with.
In terms of soil, I hear all the time from people that the soil is very poor. It's been compacted, was not good soil to begin with. And it always seems to me that if you have bad soil or difficult soil, you're always going to struggle to some degree. But when we talk about amending the soil, that's not such an easy process, is it?
Well, sometimes soil only needs compost. So as an amendment, that's pretty easy to add. It really depends on what's happening. So again, I always go back to mulch. That's your easiest way to build soil, protect soil, and over time, it will amend the soil as well. So depending on what type of mulch it is. Usually our process, regardless of the soil type, and compaction is just about everywhere, but most of the soil here in the Pacific Northwest is pretty mineral based and lacks organic matter. That's it. So adding organic matter is usually the one thing that is the ticket to success, but we can't have continual compaction. And the other thing to make soil successful is roots. Because that interaction loosens the soil. It allows water to drain into the soil. It feeds the microbes and all the organisms that are dependent on healthy soil. They need roots, water, minerals, and organic matter. So the soil is as much of an ecosystem as the garden is. And so if we start thinking in that context, then not only will our soil be healthy, but our plants will be even more healthy because they've got good soil they're growing in.
Great. I've heard you use often the term hydrologically literate. Can you talk about that? What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so I encourage people to think like a watershed. And I've even taught seminars where we do meditations, and we basically put ourselves as a raindrop falling onto a roof and think about where the water goes. So it's an incredible resource that I think people do not value, especially in a region like this where we get so much rain that sometimes it's a problem. The idea of being ecologically literate is understanding the hydrological system in place, and whether that's understanding how aquifers function, and how infiltration of recharging aquifers happens, to how we're collecting rainwater potentially, or reusing gray water, or irrigating with drip irrigation. Or so there's a big topic here, and it can go in a lot of different directions. But really, it's about understanding how water works and how valuable it is, and how to really take advantage and honor that resource rather than abuse it or waste it.
Do you have any thoughts on how an individual could go about educating themselves on that topic?
Yeah, well, I've taught several webinars with you folks. Yeah, I think starting season by season is nice. Right now, learning about irrigation is a good step. In the winter, learning about stormwater, right? So depending on the person's needs, and often this is a topic where people don't really want to engage because they don't have to, right? It's not like a beautiful flower that is really, I call it sexy. Water is one of those topics, like until your well is dry, it might not be that interesting. But I go down the rabbit hole in this topic, and I find a lot of books on water very fascinating, in the politics around water, which there's a lot on the subject. So it starts with, I think, monitoring what you have and learning. There's a lot of people that are on, they buy water from water districts. They don't even know they can monitor, right? They can look at how much they use. On my water districts, we have a website where I can go and I can see how many gallons every day that I use. So it's a really interesting thing that is available. Not very many people know about it. If someone's on a well, it may be different. They may not have a monitoring method, right? And so starting by learning first what we have and what we have available to us, and then how much we use, is a first step. There's a lot of calculation. So in the book Practical Permaculture, maybe one or two of the other ones, there's a lot of information about how to make calculations. There's a lot of resources online too, like taking the square footage of your roof and then doing a calculation based on the annual rainfall. It'll give you your natural water budget. So learning that and going, oh, I can collect 70,000 gallons of water that fall on my roof. Like, where would I put that? Like, how would I manage it? And start to understand that, okay, so maybe I used 10,000 gallons of water last month irrigating my garden. And that's an exaggeration. But right now, with the way that water availability is getting more expensive, I think this will become more important topic. Because I have clients right now who, I did a consult last week where the client paid $5,000 for 1 month of irrigating their garden. $5,000. I thought that was crazy. But here we have a nursery, and in the summer months, it's $1,000 a month. So when you're looking at making big changes to a landscape, and knowing that there's 3 years or 3 summers of irrigation needs, figuring that out is important, but also thinking long term. So water collection is another big piece of hydrological literacy, because we have such an amazing resource for so long in our climate here in the Northwest, that there's no reason we shouldn't be collecting water. A lot of people think it's illegal when it's not, on a residential scale. And tanks are fairly inexpensive for how much water costs and how much it will continue to cost. So our investment, the return on investment, is good. And I think if more people started thinking about that, we would be in a much better position, both hydrologically and as a resiliency plan, having our backups for our backups. So even if someone has a well, it doesn't mean their well is always going to be functioning. It might go dry, the pump might break, right? So what's the backup plan?
I'd like to encourage people also to keep an eye on the snowpack during the winter and into the
Mm-hmm.
summer, and also the
Mm-hmm.
reservoir levels of the regional water storage reservoirs. I think that helps keep the whole concept a little more top of the mind.
Yeah. I know you're in the mountains a lot like I am, and watching that throughout the snow season can sometimes be a little scary
Yeah.
when we have a big snow melt early on. But a lot of people aren't monitoring these things. I think it takes like water geeks like us to really be paying attention. I went on a vacation and I wanted to go to the Hoover Dam and I wanted to know all
Mm-hmm.
about the water levels, right, of Lake Mead. That was really important to me. And my friends that I was visiting were like, "What? What are you like? Why do you care?" I'm like, "Well, it's a big deal." But I think there's some education that has yet to happen for the large majority of people who
Right.
it's not an issue,
Yeah.
right? They don't have to think
But
about
we definitely need to start thinking about it more. You mentioned a
it.
couple of times drip irrigation. Can you briefly just cover some of the best applications for drip irrigation?
Yeah, so there's so many different types of irrigation, and drip irrigation I've found to be the like middle road, both cost but very effective, more so than automated overhead spray systems. Um, but on the negative side, they're more likely to fail or have breaks in them, and maybe not last as long. So good applications are brand new landscapes, vegetable gardens. Great to have drip. The problem with drip and why they're so great, the emitters emit exactly how much the plant needs directly to the plant. But there's also netafim or underground drip that is basically like has holes in it, and so it just disperses water. The danger of that kind is if someone's a gardener and they're using a shovel a lot, the lines actually feel like a root,
Mm.
and so it's easy to puncture. So that kind of drip I recommend for areas that will not be cultivated, maybe under an eco lawn or a lawn or something. But sometimes drip, if there is a failure point, whether it's a cut or a piece comes disconnected, the pressure changes and it's hard to find where. Um, and in automated systems, there's a lot more that can go wrong on a bigger scale, but all irrigation needs monitoring and it needs to be adjusted. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't think through. They think, oh, I'll set it and forget it. And the truth is, you have to change your watering needs based on the season. It's not just an on and an off, but as the plants grow too, you want to make sure that over time, the watering is getting less and less. So the plant's roots actually grow deeper and it's essentially weaning them from that resource. So if someone has their irrigation set to the exact same setting every growing season and they never change it, the root zones of those plants are not going to be adaptive to, having that turned off and then having a big heat event. So it's a little, well, not sustainable, for one, but I think it also is wasting water when we could turn that irrigation or dial it down year after year and let the plant's roots grow deeper and be more
All
resilient.
right. Well, final question for you, Jessi. What do you most enjoy about your work?
Um, it's really creative, and I really enjoy the conversations afterwards when people have made big transformations in their spaces and they are just in awe. I had a client cry yesterday because she realized that she did something that was going to invite birds into her garden. And so I think it's really connecting people to the magic of nature and watching that, like being a part of that intimate experience
That's
was really fun.
wonderful. Thank you very much, Jessi.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for being with me today. I hope you enjoyed this broadcast. If you did, please like and subscribe and follow us on the socials. You can also find helpful information about Cascade's water conservation programs at cascadewater.org. Have a great day, and remember, We need water